Hello, and welcome to my Cardfight Vanguard deck profile for the heavy artillery of Dust Storm Eugene. The second Rideline currently available for the Dragon Empire Nation and Cardfight Vanguard Overdress. This deck profile is post set 2 support, and this is a build that I have gotten some success with myself, and I've decided I'd share it online to just throw out my ideas out. We will start with the Rideline itself, starting with, of course, the starter, which is going to be Double Gun of Duststorm Bart. Like every other V starter now, if you go second on Ride, you get the draw. I'm going to do this deck profile assuming you have the base understanding of how the actual game is played, and simply go over my general thoughts of why I put the cards in, and why I think what they basically do, and why I put them in. Second, we'll deal with a Neil for the Ride line. When he's rolled upon by the grade 2, you get a soul charge. And since Eugene's secondary skill requires 5 in soul, it's quite important to get. His rear guard, he does have a rear guard skill, which is if something on your opponent's side of the field gets retired during the turn, you can counterblast one and retire to himself, and then you get another retire. In this build, I run no other version of Neil except in the Ride line. A very common thing for D decks right now as well is that the Ride line is not actually run in the deck itself. Of course, I did mention the grade 2, which is, of course, a Randor, or Cataclysmic Bullets of Duststorm Randor. So his skill when he's rolled upon by the grade 3, which is Eugene, you get a draw, and you choose a card from your draw zone and you add it to your soul. So once you've ridden up to Eugene, again, he has a secondary skill as well as when if your opponent has 2 or less rear guards, counterblast soul blast, and he'll get 5,000 power. Again, Randor, I run no other versions of this card in the deck itself. I only run him in the main line, the Ride line deck. And of course, Eugene, which is the core unit of the deck, as my final grade 3 in the Ride line. And since we are on grade 3, we might as well just discuss it. I do, of course, run 4 Eugenes. As the main ride of the deck, you do want those extra copies for the Persona ride, and Eugene's skills are very, very simple. His first skill is, they're both ass skills, but his first skill is when you can, during your turn, during your main phase, you can rest 2 of your own units to retire 1 unit on your opponent's side of the field, and then Eugene will gain 10,000 power. His secondary skill is whenever something is if something was retired on your opponent's side of the field, you can then Soul Blast 5, which if you completed your Ride line, which you of course will, you will have 5 in soul. You'll be able to Soul Blast 5 to look at the top card of the deck per open rear guard your opponent has, and then you can either call those cards to the field, to the rear guard, or add them to soul. So it does both. It can boost your field and replenish the soul to use his skill again. But the retire mechanic on himself to give that retires and boosts himself is also quite strong. If you can do that every turn, he will swing for 23, and if you got the Persona ride, he will swing by himself without a booster at 33. So that's the Eugene, of course. The other grade 3 I run in this version is 4 copies of the Penetrate Dragon Tribash. Tribash is a very, very simple grade 3. He only has a rear guard skill, and that is if once your Vanguard attacks, you can take Tribash himself and move him to the soul, and you'll give that Vanguard for that battle specifically 1 extra critical. So it's just a nice extra pressure to be given. I play 4 because he is basically a spent resource. He's a bullet in the chamber, if you will, to follow the Desert Gunner motif for going. You attack with him once, you have your Vanguard attack, you move Tribash to the soul, and then you basically add an extra critical. You can play him in the rear guard, back row rear guard as well, maybe behind your Vanguard if you don't feel like you don't have a booster to use. You can use Tribash as well. It's a very good card to pull out from Eugene's search skill as well. So that's basically it for the units grade 3s. I do run 3 copies of Sunlight Punishment, which is the Dragon Empire Order card, which functions as follows: is that for basically you counterblast as many counterblasts as you want, and then you retire the same number of units from your opponent's field as the amount of counterblasts you paid. So if your opponent has 5 units, you have 5 counterblasts, and then you just counterblast 5, you retire all those units. You can basically it'll either nuke the field, or if you only have 1 or 2, same idea, you counterblast for what is necessary. The Eugene deck as it currently stands, specifically my build, does not use a lot of counterblast. You can end up at your second ride on Eugene with no counterblast used. So this is although this card can be very expensive, it can be very useful to make sure that your skills are active, because of course a trend you'll notice that many of these cards, Eugene included, only activate once something has been retired on your opponent's field. So sometimes you might need that little extra push to make sure like you have enough open rear guards as well to make Eugene's skill worth it. Because full boxing 5 for a single card or 2 cards might not be worth it, whereas being able to nuke the field with this card can be very useful and keep your play going. And we'll move on to grade 2s, and we'll just start off with another order card, which I use here, which is the Burn Bright Pure Prayer, which is a nice little defensive order. Basically, if you have 3 or more damage, you can basically give a unit 15k. So it's a blitz order, so you can think of it as basically just a 15k shield as long as you have 3 or more damage. In my current build, the only reason I have these 2 still is that it kind of just fills out the deck. There aren't a lot of grade 2s I play over this card, really, because of how it works between Tribash and the main grade 2 that you really want for this deck, which is, of course, from D set 2, the Strong Fortress Dragon, Gibraltar. Yes, that's probably not how you pronounce it, but that's alright. I can't pronounce anything. So this is basically, this card wins and loses you games a lot, because his first skill is that if you have your Vanguard as Eugene, you can Soul Blast one and rest himself, and then you can retire one of your opponent's rear guards. It's very simple. But his secondary skill is what's really important, because if you as soon as you enter the battle phase, if your opponent has 1 or less rear guards, he'll stand himself and give himself 5k power. So in an ideal scenario, you can rest him for Eugene's skill, and then as soon as resolve those skills, retire, gain power to Eugene, and then when you go to attack your opponent, Brachio will stand himself and give him a little bit of a power boost. So it makes the fact that you need to rest your own units less becomes an advantage for you instead of a disadvantage. So this is like a must for the card for the Eugene deck currently. It is a linchpin of the deck. It wins and loses the game. And really, that's the only really grade 2s I play, because you want to have like a Brachio or even a Tribash on your rear guard, because these 2 like are your pressure. They basically become your win conditions. We'll move on to grade 1s. I like to play 3 Stealth Dragons Tenchashid. Nice and simple thing. If you boost a unit and that unit's attack hits, you then get to counterblast 1 and retire himself, and basically search out a copy of your Vanguard. So of course, if you're sitting on Eugene and you have say a column that has Tribash intention and that attack hits your opponent, you're then able to you're basically going to nuke that column, because you're probably going to get Tribash into the soul, but then Tenchashid is going to let you grab another Eugene from your deck, remove deck thinning your deck from thinning your deck of grade 3s, and in adding a Eugene to your hand to be able to Persona Ride your next turn. I run him at 3. I feel like in my current build this functions very well. You can of course play it more, but this for my build it's at 3. Next is a nice little MVP to grade 1s. It's the Stealth Thing Shiga Manango. I like to call her Mango because I, again, really bad at pronouncing things. And Shiga Mango is nice and simple. If something on your opponent's field got retired, You can then retire her, check the top card of your deck, and you can either call that to the rear guard, or if you didn't call it to the rear guard, you can add to your soul. So nice and simple. When thinking like, well, that doesn't sound great. Well, you can basically use Mango as a rest target for Eugene, so you can rest her, retire something on your opponent's side of the field, and then once that's retired, her skill will activate. So you can retire her to pull either another card for your soul to use Eugene's secondary skill if you're missing soul, or call a replacement unit for her that's not rested, because so that way you have a booster or even another column if you need it. So that's what she's great utility for this deck for that reason. And it's because it's activated on a simple retire, which this deck does plenty. Next, nice and simple, we're going to have 4 Perfect Guards. These are the new D Perfect Guards from set 1. They're just like any other Perfect Guards you've ever used before, with the exception that if you have 2 or less cards in hand, you don't have to play the discard cost to nullify the attack. So if you're sitting on 2, if you have just 2 in hand, and you got 2 giant attacks coming, you can Perfect Guard and Perfect Guard without having to discard. It's very, very much better than it used to be. I would argue that they're not as good as the old draw PGs we used to have in V era. I really like that mechanic, but of course bringing them back to grade 1s, but adding that little twist of not needing to discard with low hand is a nice change of pace as well. Next up, this is going to be the final grade 1, which is going to be 3 copies of Dragon Igniter Idris. Now on paper it's a very solid card. It is a little strange as a grade 1 with only 5,000 power, but it has a unique skill, which is also an axe skill, is that when something on your opponent's field is retired, again this continuous theme especially with this Eugene deck, you can then pay the cost of 1 counterblast, and then you have a choice. You can either have Idris gain himself 10,000 power, making him like 15k booster, or you can move him to the soul and then retire something on your opponent's side of the field that is grade 2 or higher. So this you can either increase your own strength of your column, or you can nuke more things on your opponent's field to have more checks for Eugene's skill. Because again, the best value for Eugene is if your opponent has no units on the board, you get the Soul Blast 5 to take a look, to do a check 5 on the top of your deck, and then you have the most options there, obviously. So that's him. I'm currently running a 3. You can maybe run him at 3-4 instead if you'd rather, but I haven't quite found a room for it. And the only things I would maybe cut is maybe a Mango, but I really like Mango's skill as a Eugene target. He just works pretty well for that as well. If you can only retire a few things, you can use Eugene's skill to retire maybe a pesky grade 1 or grade 0 in the back, and use Idris to retire grade 2 in the front, grade 2 or 3 in the front row, by resting, when having him rest as well. And then you move to the soul a lot like Mango, who retires herself. But again, I prefer Mango's skill to deck thin and move things around, because she of course is free, whereas Idris does retire counterblast. Now, although this deck doesn't counterblast a lot, you might need multiple counterblasts in one turn if you need to just nuke the field with the grade 2 order. Now let's move on to triggers. Triggers is actually quite simple. Of course, I play one of the Dragon Empire over triggers. You can make a case that you could use like more of vanilla over triggers. I give it a 10 million. You can give 10 million to Eugene, 10 million to a rear guard, because this deck is very rear guard focused, actually, thanks to the Brachio. But the ability to restand your Vanguard is of course quite powerful, because you will be able to reactivate certain skills. It's just more drive checks is always just better. So I run 1 copy of the Dragon Empire over trigger. Then we got 3 copies of Blaze Maiden Zune, which is the critical trigger from the trial deck, and I run 4 copies of the critical trigger from the set 1, for a total of 7 critical triggers. And of course, I run as well 4 heals, because healing is always good. You can get that 6 damage heal, you get healing early, you drag out a game. And there are two two thought patterns here. I play 4 of the new front triggers for Dragon Empire, which are just front trigger. However, if your opponent has a grade 3, it gets an extra 5k shield when used for a guard. When put in the Guardian Circle, so it makes it a 20k shield. And I really like the extra shielding power of that. But there's a very high argument to be made that it might be better to run a total of 8 crits and only 3 draws. But I really like the extra draw power because not draw power, but shield power, because this deck is not super defensive. Like, you're not going to have a lot of interceptable units because your Tribash is going to Soul, and and unless you have another Brachio or you absolutely need him to guard, you'd rather keep him on the board. So these are the triggers I like to run. Of course, you yourself can make different choices yourself. You can just swap them around. You can even run draws if you like. I used to, but I've swapped them out at this point for more crits and more fronts, because I found that this deck, because you're constantly checking the top of your deck, you're just running through cards very quickly, and you can deck yourself out right well. But that's basically it. That's my Eugene deck profile. If you were wondering how to build this deck, this is an relatively easy build to make, and there's not a lot of complicated things. The only things you really need to get is, of course, your Eugenes and your Rideline, and make sure you get your hands on some Brachios. Alright, well, good luck out there, and have some fun.